Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first COVID webinar of the 2022-2023 school year. This is our series that has addressed the legal impacts of the coronavirus on K-12 schools. We haven't done one for a while, and this is the first one of the school year. And hopefully, I know you're all wishing that it's the last one of the school year. We don't know, obviously, but we will. We had enough questions coming in, what we thought it's time to do another one just to get off on the right foot and give everyone a clean slate of information for a new school year. So we will do our best to tackle your questions that come in that you submit through the Q&A function. As always, if we don't get to a question or you have follow-up, please reach out to one of us. So I also want to introduce my colleagues. I'm joined today. I'm Jennifer Smith. I'm joined by Amy Dickerson, Nicki Bazer, and Shelli Anderson.
Hi, everyone.
And please also check out our website at franczek.com where you will find an archive of all of our COVID resources, webinars, alerts, blogs, a podcast. And make sure to subscribe to our alerts if you're not already to get regular materials. So with that, we want to start today. It is today the COVID topic. So I want to set the stage. A lot of the questions we got in advance were really asking the same essential question, which was, what is required? What is mandatory? So on most topics we're going to be talking about today, what we have is guidance. And we even have an explicit, recommendation that school districts use their local authority or their authority that they have pursuant to the school code in order to make decisions and follow through or take action based on the guidance. So that is going to be true for most topics. We'll make sure and flag and clearly cover when that's not true, and we're talking about a law that has a requirement or something that could be construed potentially as a mandate for other reasons. But we did just want to lay the groundwork there. So that means really you on the webinar, school administrators have a lot of authority and decision making and local control on these issues. So with that, Amy, set the stage for us on where we are as far as managing student absences.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. So in terms of managing student absences specifically related to COVID and a positive test or case for COVID-19, essentially, we're in the same place that we were at the end of the past school year in terms of the guidance we have. So, I'll go through that briefly. Of course, we will be looking out for any additional guidance that we get. But for now, really, the guidance we have remains the same, particularly, the IDPH guidance that we had where we were at the end of the last school year is largely the same. We currently have a current decision tree, which sets forth the guidance for managing student absences who test positive for COVID-19 from IDPH. That is the sort of main guidance doc from IDPH that's currently in effect. And again, that particular decision tree includes that express disclaimer that Jennifer alluded to, that schools must make local decisions informed by local context in consultation with the local public health department, and that the decision chart provides recommendations that should be considered in conjunction with the CDC guidance. So the guidance we have from IDPH are technically recommendations for what school districts should do. And those are for students who test positive or report a positive case for days 1 through 5. The guidance is for those that can mask upon return, to isolate for at least 5 calendar days from the onset of symptoms, and if 24 hours with no fever or without fever reducing medication, and other symptoms, particular symptoms have ceased for 24 hours and improvement of symptoms. With regard to days 6 through 10, the guidance still calls for consistent masking upon return through day 10. And if someone is unable to mask, for them to continue to isolate for 10 days. For students out isolating due to being positive, we'll discuss later the current guidance or rather lack thereof, some current guidance regarding providing remote instruction to those students. But in terms of the guidance regarding isolation and masking upon return, it really remains the same as to where we were at the end of the last school year. So I noted, with ISBE guidance, we can see in their archived materials that they've got a chunk of guidance that was back to school guidance from the 2021-22 school year and the year prior. We don't currently see that back to school guidance that they've issued on their website for this coming school year. So, we'll see if and when we get any of that from ISBE and how, if at all, that would change, at least when it comes to the guidance that I just went through here.
Great. And Nicki, same basic question. Can you give us a lay of the land for staff absences due to COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, same guidance and really the same things that Amy just took us through. It's the likewise for students, for staff, if they do test positive for COVID, they should be staying home for those first 5 days until they're symptom free or they have no fever and improvement of symptoms. And then days 6 through 10, there is again the recommendation for masking or to continue to exclude. So we're really, again, in the same place, unless your local health departments are issuing new and different guidance in that regard. We're going to continue to ask people to stay home when they test positive for those shorter time periods.
So we got a question in the Q&A, and it applies to what both you and Amy just said. So for days 1 to 5, the question is that just guidance? So are they not required to exclude for days 1 to 5? I'll leave it there and let you answer.
Yeah, again, as Amy mentioned, the current IDPH decision tree explicitly says at the top that schools must make local decisions informed by local context. So it remains guidance only at this point. We see no specific mandates. Again, unless there is a mandate that has been issued by your local public health department, in which case it could be a requirement, but in terms of the state and the federal guidance, those are all just guidance at this point.
So now, I mean, you kind of come to some common sense, because pre-COVID, I mean, a lot of the symptoms are things that you have always used your local control to exclude students with fevers, for example, or you've had, said you had to be fever free for 24 hours. You can still say, use that same local control, and based on the guidance, have your standard be, we are asking you to stay home or telling you to stay home, requiring you to stay home from days 1 to 5. I think, and we can talk more about the guidance, the impact somewhat is one that some of our clients are dealing with in court. And it is, you're using your local guidance, not that you're being mandated by the state to exclude. And that's going to make a difference maybe when you're sued, for example, who's a defendant and what the defenses are.
Yeah, I mean, your point is a great one, Jen, because of course, if someone has a fever, if someone is vomiting, if someone has diarrhea, they should not be in your school building. So if kids are sick or if staff are sick, and just like you have for time in memoriam, you can exclude folks who are sick from your school buildings, they should stay home. But in terms of sort of regimented requirements, again, unless someone is issued some sort of quarantine or isolation order from the public health department, or you get directives, we're talking about sort of using current district policy, common sense, your local scenarios and your context to make the decisions on how to invite people back into the building after a positive test.
So Shelli, then one of the, I would say, hottest issues, the one that we got most commonly for this webinar is, can you explain the COVID leave law then going forward?
Sure. Yes, I think you're right. This is the question I think we got most for this webinar, as well as just questions we're getting in from clients every day is what happens now moving into the 22-23 school year. And I think that the best way to look at it as of right now, and things might change moving forward, is that COVID paid administrative leave is still in effect as long as the employee is absent for one of the specific qualifying reasons. So it's not for somebody who's out sick for an extended period of time for COVID. You don't have to give them COVID leave days for that. But in terms of the ability to stay home, it is for that period of isolation. If they test positive for COVID, if they are close contact to someone who's a confirmed case, if their child is excluded from elementary or secondary school for either of those reasons, that qualifies them for that period of paid administrative leave to be home and not have to use their own sick days. So again, it's test positive, close contact of a confirmed case, is excluded from school due to COVID symptoms. So that's kind of what we were just talking about, is that if you as a school are excluding them because of the symptoms, then related to COVID, or school policy is in effect that excludes them from school because of those symptoms related to COVID, those days would qualify for paid administrative leave. Now, with the guidance that speaks to stay home for 5 days, come back masked on day 6, arguably the only days that they would be excluded, unless your school has done something differently, is just on those days 1 through 5. So those would be the days that would qualify. Now, this all may change moving forward, but at least for right now, that's kind of the lay of the land moving into this school year. And we've got a lot of questions about, but how do we know if this actually qualifies? You are certainly within your right to ask for documentation of the exclusion of their child from school, the actual positive test that they have, or some other documentation showing that they were a close contact of someone who was a positive case. So you have the right to do all of that. And if you have further questions about that, we're happy to talk through what that could look like with you.
Yeah, and just a reminder, Shelli, and I think you were going to say this at the beginning, which is that this only applies to fully vaccinated staff. And at this point, that doesn't include a booster. We're just talking about the 2 shots for the 2 main COVID vaccines, and then obviously 1 for J&J. And I know that this, from a practical standpoint, I've gotten a lot of questions about, well, what happens if someone's out with symptoms and then they later test negative? Are those days that they were out with symptoms eligible? I mean, there's a lot of sort of devil in the details with this. So I think when in doubt, certainly you can call us as you try to sort through this. But I think requiring the documentation and getting information from your staff is certainly an essential element to it.
Yeah, and I think following up, Nicki, on the vaccinated piece is that, we do have questions from some school districts about, can we offer the same sort of leave to our unvaccinated staff? And the answer to that is yes, you can. For your unionized staff, this would be something that you'd enter into an MOU with your unions as far as how you're going to do this or what it's going to look like. So, and I know many of you watching have done this already that we've worked with. So this is something that, again, local control, you can decide to give this additional benefit if you want to. But as far as what the mandate is, it just requires the person to be vaccinated.
And I do see a question came in about just where to kind of find some more details, just generally about the leave law. And we did put out last spring or winter, whenever it was last year when this first came out, a Q&A that really tried to kind of detail what the requirements were. And that's still on the thought leadership section of our website. So that should hopefully provide some basic details with regard to the requirements too.
Yeah, and there's a lot of questions about this extending into the 22-23 school year. So, and that there was a lot of, I think, impression out there that this was only in effect for the 21-22 school year. And the confusion is warranted. It's a sort of a confusing law, the way that they wrote it. Just to be clear, and again, as Amy points out, this is really explained in detail in some of our posts. But for the 21-22 school year, the requirement was that if someone had used a sick day for that school year and was eligible, then when the law passed in April, they could get that sick day reinstated. But the requirement to provide administrative leave days was not cabinet by the 21-22 school year. The law states that it is for whenever there is a disaster declaration in place. So in terms of the answer as to how long it's going to extend into the 22-23 school year, we don't know. It is so long as the governor continues to issue disaster declarations. So again, vaccinated staff, not yet a booster requirement. If they meet one of the eligibility requirements under the law, they do get administrative leave if they are out for those COVID-related reasons.
And one of the, I'm sorry, Ben, just real quick, I just want to answer one of the questions that came up in the Q&A that's kind of related to what Nicki's talking about, is this idea of if they choose to take sick leave moving forward, are they still eligible to get that reinstated as paid administrative leave? And the answer to that is no. That was something that was in effect for last school year. So moving into this school year, if an employee chooses to take paid sick leave on a day that they would not otherwise be excluded from school related to the COVID qualifying reason, you do not have to shift that into some sort of paid administrative leave beyond what you otherwise would do. So that's the part that is stopped, which I think is what's caused a lot of the confusion between, sick leave and paid administrative leave and how you handle that.
So another clarification, same point. Nicki, could you explain how medical or religious exemptions impact this COVID leave law application?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's no explicit requirement to apply medical or religious exemptions in the COVID leave law. However, the COVID leave law itself does not override civil rights laws. So the rights under both state and federal civil rights laws. If you have a disability or a medical reason for not getting a vaccine, or you have a religious exemption for getting vaccinated, then you too would be able to take advantage of the COVID leave law. One of the things that we have advised districts, though, is that they should require, if an employee is asserting either a medical or a religious exemption that would enable them to get leave under this law, they should be required to submit information to that effect. I know because a lot of districts were allowing unvaccinated staff to test, they never went through the process of actually sort of reviewing and granting or denying either medical or religious exemptions. So now would be the time to do that if you're getting requests from unvaccinated staff. So for example, we have a long form that districts can send out to employees who are requesting religious exemption to explain the basis of their religious exemption. Likewise, you should do that in the case of a medical exemption. So we do believe that those would be recognizable exemptions for someone who is unvaccinated. But again, making sure that you get the documentation to support providing such an exemption.
And Nicki, another clarifying question, is there a maximum number of days?
There is not. The only limitation is that this law is in effect when the disaster declaration is in place. And I know that this is causing a lot of consternation amongst folks. I'm getting some texts as we speak about it. I realize this sort of unending number of days is concerning, but at this point, there is no limitation within the law.
Okay. Then next, we're going to shift a little bit. Amy, what about remote instruction for students out due to COVID? Can you give us the lay of the land there?
Yeah, and I sort of hinted at this earlier. So, our remote learning guidance from ISBE that we were operating under for the last school year, which was titled Current Remote Learning Options under Illinois law, is actually now housed on ISBE's website as part of its archived materials for the 2021-22 school year. So we currently do not have clear guidance on remote instruction requirements or recommendations for the 2022-23 school year from ISBE. So there's no clear requirement right now that they have to provide remote instruction in the manner in which it was provided last year for students who were out due to a positive case. Now, while we know that some of you, a few of you have already started school, some of you are about to be, and some will be in the coming weeks. You very well may get some guidance on this in the coming weeks, from ISBE, and if anything is issued in the coming weeks with regard to, from ISBE, we probably would expect that this might be something that they would address. And for now and for today, we'll have to just wait and see what comes out for that.
Great. Now I want to back up to one of the questions we had come in the Q&A, and we can all talk about it a little bit. The question was stated, guidance has been released by some law firms stating districts should not require masking on days 6 to 10. What is your recommendation? I'll jump in there a little bit. I'm speculating. I don't know the basis of other law firms recommending this. I would speculate it's because of the litigation that's out there. But at this current time, there is no orders under any litigation that bars any school district in the state of Illinois from using your local authority as you see fit to keep your building safe. So now there might be a cost-benefit analysis if you don't want to be sued and this is something that might provoke a lawsuit, but that's different than not being able to, and certainly I would not make a recommendation either way. You should decide where your mitigation is, what your mitigation measures are going to be. I don't see a reason to be driven by litigation risk necessarily on that point. I don't know if you guys feel any differently.
I absolutely agree. And I think, at this point, we've seen pretty definitively from the appellate court that they at least are operating under an understanding that school districts do have the authority to set their mitigation measures. Obviously, something could happen in the future. We may see different results, but and nobody wants to be dragged into these lawsuits. We certainly understand, but absolutely, I would never issue a blanket recommendation one way or the other as to what you do about that particular masking. That's really going to be something that you're going to figure out on the local level. And one of the things that I think we'll hit on throughout this is that we understand that there's an uptick in cases in a number of different places and the variants that are coming through. And so there may be, the reality at your local school level in one place may be very different in another location. And so those are the types of things that we're going to see driving these decisions, I think.
All right, so then back to remote instruction. Nikki, if you did have teachers who want to provide remote instruction when they would otherwise be excluded, what is your perspective on that situation?
Sure. And so just to orient us again, we're talking about those 5 days likely that someone is excluded because of a positive COVID test, or perhaps a little bit longer if the student is out sick. Obviously, Amy described the lay of the land in terms of what was required, but if teachers want to provide instruction remotely, they certainly can do so. There's nothing prohibiting that. That would be certainly something that you'd want to talk about with your teachers union in advance, if that was going to be an expectation or even something that was available. Obviously, I know some districts would be concerned that some teachers were doing it and some weren't. So probably a uniform policy makes some sense. But again, sitting down with your teachers unions, talking about through those, thinking about whether or not that makes sense from a logistical standpoint. But it's certainly something that districts have the authority to do.
Okay. And Shelli, probably the hottest topic during all of COVID, masks. Are there any masking mandates that apply for the upcoming school year?
So I am happy to report, or be the one to report, that there are not any masking mandates as we enter this new school year. There obviously might be circumstances, as Nicki mentioned, that it might behoove a specific school district based on cases or other circumstances that you want to enter into that world again and need to enter into that world again. Tiptoeing carefully, I'm sure. But as of right now, in terms of what's come down from the state, that is not a requirement as we enter this school year. And again, everything could change, as you all know. We don't have ISBE guidance yet. We can probably expect it sometime after you've all started the school year, but hopefully we will see it. And that might say something different, but for right now, that's kind of what we know and how you can all hopefully enter with the most normal year that we've had in a while.
So just Shelli, I want to bring up a discussion we were having earlier, because when we were thinking about mask mandates, we started to talk a little bit about, could a district for individuals require masking of either staff around someone who is high risk or medically frail as a reasonable accommodation. And I want to flag that issue because as we were talking about, I think our conclusion is, and how the cases have started to develop, the factual patterns we're seeing in cases is, yes, that very likely could be a reasonable accommodation where you're requiring specific staff in order to serve and support certain students who have that need, that they would mask. Again, not a universal masking requirement, but it could be either of staff or students potentially. Again, with accommodations, it's always complicated because you're looking at all the alternatives, all the other potential accommodations that would also meet the need. There's usually not one thing that has to happen, but that could potentially be a reasonable accommodation. Okay, so Nicki, looking at guidance around whether weekly testing for unvaccinated staff is required, could you help us understand the lay of the land on that?
Sure. There is still an executive order in place that has been in place now, I think, for a number of years that requires the testing of unvaccinated staff, although it now allows, there's guidance that allows for in-home testing of, like, if you just using at-home tests for this purpose. If you're not running a testing program or you want to talk with us, I would suggest talking to your legal counsel, either us or whomever it is, about this requirement, this executive order, and how it looks going into the next school year. And in terms of that, the definition of vaccinated remains the same, which is just, again, the base vaccinations, not the boosters at this point.
Okay. All right. And then we're getting a couple of questions, Amy. So I just thought maybe we could put another exclamation point or period on what you talked about in terms of remote learning. So do you want to, again, summarize, do they have to provide remote learning for students who are home with COVID?
So we have no requirements like we had last year. The guidance that was in place essentially said that we had to, due to quarantining or exclusion, that we do not have any guidance in place that currently has those requirements. And it's very clear that guidance has been moved to sort of the archive materials of ISBE. So we're at the place where we don't have that any clear requirement right now to do that in the way that we did last year.
All right, then shifting a little bit, this is a question we got in advance. Shelli, does the superintendent need board approval for a revised in-person learning plan?
Sure, and we got these questions a lot during last year and the year before we were answering them. And so right now, that remains the same, that the state, the statute only requires that the superintendent do this and adopt a plan and have a plan in place. Really, I think you should follow what you've done in years past with respect to whether or not the board adopts the plan as well. I think that, that should be one of the main factors you look at, certainly from a potential litigation standpoint, as well as if you are named in one of the current lawsuits that are out there. That could also be a factor as to whether or not the board takes action to adopt it. It could be something as simple as the board adopting a resolution that gives the superintendent authority to make those decisions, as opposed to what specifically the decisions are. But there's no legal requirement from a statutory perspective that the board adopt it. Certainly our recommendation is to, again, look at what your practice has been. And in terms of how divisive things have been around COVID, decisions that are made, if it's something that the board has adopted in the past and it's going to be at all specific with respect to what your requirements are going to be, to have the board adopt that as well and make sure that they're weighing in on that so the community can see that it's, everyone making that decision together. If that's something you've done in the past, I know many of our districts have been able to, in different communities, that the superintendent's been able to make the decision and that's been able to kind of move forward and certainly allow them to move more swiftly in the event that changes are needed. So it's really district to district.
Jen, to the extent that there's some additional questions on the masking accommodation issue, with regard to kind of what an example of how this might look for a district. If a district has a parent, for example, of an early childhood student with significant medical needs with a one-on-one assistant, can that parent request that the district require that all related staff and teachers and even the aide wear a mask around their child and have that added to the IEP?
Yes, certainly they can ask, and then it would be, then you'd go through your decision-making process, which if it's a student with an IEP, accommodations are usually addressed in the IEP. So either you could amend the IEP if it's just agreeable, or if you need a team discussion to talk about and think about, okay, what is the need here? Is it no close contacts? It doesn't, if the request doesn't make sense because the student's in close proximity to a lot of people throughout the day, and that's really not any kind of accommodation that is workable or makes sense, then the team might want to meet and brainstorm about what are the parents' concerns and how can we address them. But in general, so I'm not saying it's always going to be something they would grant, but there could be times when you would. Let me put it that way. So maybe along those lines, Nicki, if you have instructional aides, and I think this is the kind of question that sometimes we get, parents want to know the names and maybe even other information about the health status of the aides that are working with their children. What would you, what information would or wouldn't you provide to parents?
Yeah, You should not be revealing the names of staff members who have tested positive for COVID. And I think most districts consistently did not provide that information last year and the year before. I understand that because it's a sort of a different terrain, you know, we're not excluding close contacts in the same way. But there's no reason that districts can't continue to notify parents or other staff members or other students that someone that they've come into contact with has tested positive. Obviously, then there's not typically any specific exclusionary period, but it allows someone to test their child at home or do at-home testing or go get a PCR test if they want. Some districts continue to do testing. So you can certainly notify parents or staff members that either their student or they themselves have come into contact with someone who tested positive. But again, I would not reveal those names to folks, you know, in terms of the specific information.
So Shelli, there's a few questions that I think clarify this that you that I want to ask to you that people pose in the Q&A. So are districts still allowed to ask for vaccination cards from staff to have on file?
Yeah, so you are still allowed to require that. Again, this is something that you might need to talk to your unions about. Most districts we work with, the unions were agreeable to this and did not have any issue with making sure that the district had some proof of vaccination status. I think especially now, while the state is mandating a benefit to those individuals, it becomes even more likely that you might want to get proof that that person is actually vaccinated. I did see that there was one other question that came in about a local public health department identifying that their booster was needed, and I had not heard of that. So that's something certainly that if that person wants to let us know kind of which health department that is offline, we're happy to look at that as well. But yeah, absolutely, you can require proof of vaccination.
One of the other questions that came in that I've sort of struggled with, and I would be interested off the cuff what other folks think, is the question about, let's say someone is out on Monday due to COVID-like symptoms and then tests negative on Tuesday. Is that employee eligible for a paid admin day on Monday because they were out for COVID-related symptoms, but then ultimately tested negative? You know, my inclination is that they should be given a paid leave day, but I'd be willing to be talked out of it if my colleagues thought otherwise. But I do think that it's because you are asking them to stay home with symptoms for COVID and test. You know, I think it's a little bit of a blurry area though for the law.
I think you're right. And I think that the way that the law is written, you know, excluded from school for COVID-like symptoms are kind of based on the policy of the school. So making sure that you're communicating with staff about what is expected of them and when they are to stay home related to COVID-like symptoms. So, you know, I don't think we're living in a world anymore where every headache is deemed to be potentially COVID. Certainly if you suddenly lost your sense of taste, although I don't think that that's happening quite as much anymore. But I mean, if there was some specific COVID-like symptom, I think that might be a little bit different, but really as specific as you can get with your employees about what the expectations are, I think is what would drive the answer to that question.
And, you know, second only to masks, maybe close contact exclusion is something we haven't talked about yet today. But Shelli, can you add, where are we with excluding for close contacts?
Well, and I don't think that if you're vaccinated, you know, a vaccinated person does not need to be excluded, stay home, if they've been a close contact of someone who is an actual confirmed case. So, I mean, that's the first piece of it. If they become symptomatic, obviously there's a change in that. Now, when you look at the basis for qualifying COVID leave, and one of them is exposure, you know, to a close contact, the question becomes then, do they even need to be excluded though? And if you're not symptomatic, you don't need to be excluded if you are vaccinated. So I think that hopefully captures the different scenarios that can come up there with respect to that. So if you become symptomatic, however, that's a whole different story, and that's why it falls into a different category of leave.
So Nicki and Shelli, can you give us another lay of the land? How are we seeing this impact bargaining, if at all?
I'll get started and then Nicki can jump in. You know, I think that contracts that are being bargained now, we are not seeing it. I'm not seeing it as much of an issue as it was last year or the year before as it relates specifically to health and safety. The way that I've seen it come up now is really more of a lingering impact of the work that needed to be done during COVID, as well as the significant rise in discipline issues and social emotional issues that teachers are seeing in students and having to work with. And that relating to additional plan time and in some instances, additional compensation. Nicki, I don't know if you're seeing that as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think for those who have been bargaining this past year, still bargaining going through, you have sort of the dual exciting things of rampant inflation and a post-COVID world where people feel, staff and teachers feel exhaustion at a level that we've really not seen before. And so I do think those things are really vying for primary attention at the table. And we are seeing, requests for more money, for bonuses or stipends related to both of those issues. Again, not seeing so much about health and safety requirements specifically like we were seeing before, but definitely I think we're still feeling the effects of the pandemic at the table, and that's a narrative that I think we'll continue to feel and hear throughout the bargaining in this school year as well.
So we did get another question that I think Amy, we could talk about a little bit more. The recent guidance, so the current IDPH ISBE joint summary says at the end of one of the paragraphs, it talks about remote instruction must be provided for, I believe it says quarantining or quarantined or excluded students. Do you want to talk a little bit more about how you read that or what you think in terms of, does that impose a requirement?
Yeah. So that is the recent guidance that was issued by ISBE and IDPH. That's just the joint summary of CDC's guidance for COVID-19 prevention in schools. So it states that guidance, is the current guidance that was issued at the time earlier in the summer. And it says that schools must continue to provide remote learning to any student who is under isolation or quarantine for COVID-19 based on the state superintendent's remote learning declaration, and then links to that remote learning guidance that then is archived. So, so we've got that there. So that does raise the question of, is it then still required, and is it a best practice to then follow that requirement based on what ISBE is expecting, versus is there any, modification to that, given that the guidance is clearly, housed in their website as something that was previously in place for the past school years. So, I think that with the current guidance, if we're looking at, is this a very clear requirement? The questions are present based on what I went through, and it's really beneficial, I think, then to talk through with, legal counsel as to, how to best interpret that based on what your plans are. Certainly for the question of, that I think was in the chat of can we, based on, what we saw from ISBE and IDPH in the last guidance that they issued, providing remote instruction would be consistent with that, but we'd want to make sure then too that your current COVID plans and everything with your authority to continue to do that are in place.
I just want to say, I'm sorry. If to the extent that it talks about isolation and quarantine, though, we do want to remember that those are now terms that have been hotly litigated. They're currently continue to be litigated. You do not isolate, you do not quarantine, you exclude students. And it is a very different standard and what you have local control to do. So to the extent that the declaration related to something that only the public health department can do through a process that they have, I think that also, Amy, I would say has to play into the analysis of what's actually required.
I was just going to say, as much as we all enjoy the choose your own adventure that is trying to figure out ISBE and IDPH guidance, if there's someone out there from ISBE listening in, it would be great to get sort of updated guidance. We're not seeing like a 22, 23 3 school year back to school guidance, which I think would be helpful. Obviously, if a kid is out sick and you're able to provide through whatever method, you know, what the work is, what the makeup tests are, et cetera, like you would do with any illness, I think that that still holds as a best practice. I think it's a real hard sort of path to go down to say that that ISBE is somewhere requiring synchronous, like, you know, 5 hours of synchronous remote learning for the 5 days that a student is excluded. I think, I don't know, I don't read you could go down the path of saying that if you link one document to another that's required. That just does not seem to be the intent. And I don't see that that was what was happening in the spring. I think what I saw most districts doing again is providing access through Google Classroom and other methods of the work, updating students so that they're able to make up the work when they return. And, you know, again, ISBE could come out with something tomorrow or perhaps mid-September that changes the full landscape of what's going on. But I think, you know, I think Amy's sort of walk us through this is, I think the best approach at this point is to continue to work to provide access to students who are, of course, sick. Dana always reminds us that these kids are also, some of them are actually sick and maybe needs a couple of days off. And, you know, maybe we'll see something more from ISBE as the school year proceeds.
So next we had a question about is the definition of, so we're getting questions about close contacts and contact tracing. Do any of you want to weigh in on, again, where are we with, do we have to contact trace? If you have any feedback on contact tracing.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say, and I'm happy to have others weigh in as well, is that the definition of what a close contact is in guidance, right? And so, you know, you can, if for districts that are still doing contact tracing, and you can certainly follow the guidance document as to what is a close contact. And certainly that would be a method if that's the way that you want to go. There's no explicit requirement now to contact trace and to exclude close contacts. I know some districts continue to do so though, and so the guidance would certainly be, I think, a good place to follow in terms of the definitions. I think that the fear is expressed in this question and others is that it would just, if you start excluding close contacts of every positive case, and even, you know, that means unvaccinated, you're now excluding a lot of students. And I think most districts have really moved away from that practice. Again, we really don't know what the next school year will bring in terms of local metrics. And so that's going to be something that you're going to be thinking about at the local level, and what you're seeing in terms of if you're seeing outbreaks in certain buildings or classrooms, you may be adjusting and pivoting depending on that. But at this point, all of the discussion of close contacts, both the definition, the times of exclusion, and when you don't need to exclude, are really all in guidance at this point. There are no mandates in place.
Yeah, I think with most districts as of last year moving away from specifically kind of knowing where every student is in every instance. I mean, even determining, Nicki, to your point about it being such a large group, you would even have to exclude. I mean, I certainly think, you know, if there's someone in your student's class and giving notice to the class itself that someone has tested positive, that might be all we're doing moving forward. And certainly to the extent those kids are vaccinated in that class, but I understand with kind of the younger ones, maybe the statistics are a little lower on the percentage of kids who are actually vaccinated. But I think that most districts I work with are moving and have moved away from this idea of any longer being kind of an arm of the public health department who is, you know, contact tracing in their districts.
Yeah, and there's a great sort of comment that we got in at the Q&A about sending out notifications. If, you know, even if you're just sending out notifications, that there were so many by the end that it's sort of become meaningless. And it's sort of like, if you're entering the school building, you should just understand that this is what's going on. And certainly, again, we would always recommend that you know your community, you listen to the feedback of your parents, of your staff, what's useful to them. We got some questions about COVID dashboards. Again, all of those things are really, there's no requirements to post numbers. There's no requirements to send out notifications. It's really about what you think is is your community is looking for, what kind of information they want to have at their fingertips, understanding that I think at this point folks know that if they're entering into a public space, that there is a certain risk of COVID exposure. So again, we'll leave that to you all to decide at the local level.
So another question, what do we expect in terms of changes in the guidance? Nikki, do you have a?
Yeah, I mean, I really, this is, you know, I really think that it's going to be largely dependent on the path that COVID takes as the school year starts. I mean, if there are spikes in certain areas, we may see local health departments, particularly the ones that have been more involved in the local decision making of school districts, coming out with more stringent guidance or even some mandates, depending on what's happening at the local level. We really don't know what the school year is going to look like given the current variants. So I think that's where we are likely to see, and if we are going to see any changes, that's where we're going to see them. As Amy mentioned, ISBE hasn't reissued, we talked about this, much of the guidance, so it's possible that they will come out with some new guidance. I just think we, you know, as we've seen some flexibility as we continue to roll through this, I think we're going to have to, districts are going to have to continue to have that kind of flexibility as they see how the local level is looking.
I think from a federal level as well, I mean, the CDC has not updated its guidance for a few months now related to schools. So I think that with that will likely come something from responsive from IDPH. It might not be right away, but at least with them we'll have something that's kind of more applicable to heading into this school year as opposed to where it was, you know, at the end of the last school year. So that'll probably give us some movement as well in one direction or another.
So we did get a question, and I gave somewhat of an update, but about the DeVore litigation. And so it's not just one litigation at this point. I think Nikki and I can attest. It's many, whatever the multiple of litigation is. So Nikki, what might be a helpful summary for folks to know?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's an ever moving process. As you said, Jen, and I think this is the most important point, there are no pending orders in any of these cases. In the big cases, the student case that had hundreds of districts, and the smaller staff case that I think had a lesser number of districts, there are motions currently pending to dismiss those cases, which will be presumably taken up by the court at some point very soon. There's argument this week actually on those issues. So those are sort of the two big cases that folks are involved in. So we will likely have a decision on the dismissal order soon. And there are some other cases where have also been filed in Springfield. There's been a lot of different pathways that those cases have gone down. Again, I think the big takeaway for this group is that there's been no orders, and actually very little has been done in those cases substantively. There's been a lot of procedural sort of shenanigans at the shenanigans being the very technical legal litigation term for this at the first part of these cases. And so we're going to wait to see still. But again, none of these cases should, from a legal standpoint, prevent a district from entering any mitigation orders at their local level. I understand that the risk of litigation is always sort of hanging over everybody, but there's nothing that prevents you from doing what you need to do at your local level.
All right, so I thought it might be fun to end with a lightning round, and people watching can test themselves, see if they answer the same as you. So I'm gonna say a mitigation, and I want to hear your guys' answers on whether it's required or suggested. So close contact exclusions. Nothing?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought Nikki was answering because her mute went off. In terms of excluding close contacts, I don't even know if it's suggested, because if you have vaccinated, I don't even know if it falls in either category. So I thought you were trying to trick us there, Jen.
Trick question. All right. Physical distance between desks.
Recommended, not required.
Masking days 6 to 10.
That's a should, in consultation with your local health department.
Exclusion days 1 to 5.
I should, but local control to make those decisions.
Paid leave for COVID positive for staff.
If someone is vaccinated, it is a requirement.
All right, remote instruction when parents call students in sick.
So we hope to get further guidance from ISBE, explaining why what they did last year is now archived. But you know, for now that remains based on what I've described earlier.
Yeah. So hopefully this is a good comment. Someone commented, they're asking if they'll get to watch this again because it was helpful and maybe we moved kind of fast. So yes, we do post these webinars. They're free and you'll be able to access them after the webinar. Anything else you ladies want to mention before we wrap up?
Well, there were a bunch of questions that I did want to address about required documentation to support a COVID absence. I do think, again, having a form that you send out if a staff member is requesting COVID leave can be helpful, or Google Doc. In terms of the required documentation, I think it's going to largely depend on the reason that the person is out. So, for example, if they're caring for a child who's been excluded from school, it may be a positive test of that child. It may be also an email from the school excluding them. If they themselves are excluded because of COVID, it may be, again, a positive test result. So I don't know that we can say that there's a definitive amount of documentation or a specific piece that is required, but it's enough to establish that the person is out for a reason that is required under the law to provide them with a COVID leave day.
Yeah, and I know that, you know, with so many people doing home tests, you know, myself included recently, the idea being that you have to potentially trust your employees and have them sign off on an affidavit of some sort indicating that that is the reason for their leave, that they tested positive on a particular day. So I do know that some of the districts we work with are relying on that, other than someone, you know, taking a picture of their home test positive and bringing it in. So, I mean, it really depends. Again, talk to your unions, as you know, you'll often hear us say, if it involves unionized employees, but just using common sense and your best judgment kind of as we work through this year, and fingers crossed this, you know, eventually becomes something that we don't have to deal with quite so often.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. And hopefully we won't have any more of these, but I suspect we might. All right.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.